Gabriel hat Australien angesprochen und da werden wir jetzt dann unser nächstes Gespräch hinrichten. Wir werden Kevin Rudd kennenlernen, den ehemaligen Premierminister, der zugeschaltet wird und sich den Fragen stellt von Nico Luchsinger. Er ist Geschäftsführer der Asia Society Schweiz. Herzlich willkommen, Nico Luchsinger.
Good morning and hello, Kevin. I'm going to do this in English, the introduction as well, so Kevin will understand me. It's my great pleasure to welcome, at least virtually here on stage to Lucerne, Kevin Rudd, who I believe is joining us today from Melbourne. Kevin, of course, was the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 2007 to 2010. He went on to become Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012, before then returning as Prime Minister in 2013. He did, and I think this is important for today's conversation, start his career actually as a China scholar. He served as an Australian diplomat in Beijing for many years, and he is, as he will no doubt demonstrate to us in just a few minutes, a proficient Mandarin speaker. Kevin has been the global president of Asia Society since January 2021. Asia Society is a global organization with 14 centers around the world. We here in Switzerland are one of them that is dedicated to understanding of Asia and its role in the world. Lastly, Kevin is also the author of a forthcoming book called The Avoidable War, ? The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China, which is out in April 2022. Kevin, welcome to Lucerne.
Great to be with you, Nico. Can you hear me loud and clear?
We can hear you well. Thank you very much. Kevin, let's start off with a broad question. I know you like being asked broad questions, so it's always hard to keep up with news from and on China. Just in recent months, we've seen China crack down on its tech industry, introduce a concept called common prosperity, make seemingly huge advances in defense technology, and sign a climate change agreement with the US. In just a few short minutes, can you try to make sense for us of the recent developments in China and what they mean for us here in Europe and for the world?
Okay, I'll do my best, Nico. Greetings from Sydney in Australia. I'm not in Melbourne at the moment. And it's good to be with our Swiss Centre of the Asia Society and you, Nico, in particular, and with this gathering of the Europa Forum in Lucerne. The Australian ambassador, a good friend of mine, Philip Green, is with you as well, my former chief of staff. You've asked some questions about recent developments in the Chinese economy, in particular what China is doing with tech, what it's doing with finance and property, and more generally its economic policy direction. Let me try and put it to you in these terms. Number one, Xi Jinping, in overall direction, has decided to move the center of gravity of Chinese economic policy towards the left. What do I mean by that? A greater priority to be attached to the power of the party in relation to, let's call it, the technocratic expertise of state officials. Secondly, a greater priority to ideological questions as opposed to, shall we say it, pure technical competence. Thirdly, a greater priority to state planning as opposed to the pure operation of the market. And on top of that, a preference for state-owned enterprises over some of the bigger private firms. And beyond all that, again, a new doctrine of national self-reliance, particularly in technology, but in other categories as well, and a new wealth redistribution agenda called the Common Prosperity Agenda. All this has emerged over the course of the last several years, but gained intensity in the last 12 months. And the critical question, therefore, will be, put all these things together, to what extent will it impact negatively the animal spirits alive in the Chinese economy and the business sector, and the extent to which that actually slows China's overall growth trajectory in the future, beyond any other macroeconomic consideration. Back to you, Nico.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You mentioned this move to the left that we've seen. You've said that it possibly could mean a slowing down of the economy. Now, China has, of course, grown tremendously over the last decades and has created, a fairly large economic and political elite, a growing middle class. What's your sense, within the political elite? How are these changes that are, touching on some of these people's direct personal wealth? How are they being seen? Is there not a risk that the current Chinese government is running of angering this fairly powerful elite with these moves? How are they thinking about that?
Well, you're right to pose the question, Nico. The bottom line is, I've had this discussion with a number of American experts. I'm normally based in New York. I run an American-based think tank called the Asia Society. And the analogy I often use is these measures of themselves will not kill the goose that laid the golden egg, but it's likely to slow it down a lot. That's the difference. There are probably 2 or 3 factors here. One is there's an adjustment of the Chinese growth model occurring anyway between a low-wage, labor-intensive manufacturing for export matched with high levels of public sector state investment in infrastructure, turbocharging its way into the double-digit growth we've all become familiar with over the last 20 to 25 years. Moving to a slower growth model based on higher levels of domestic consumer demand, continued reasonable levels of state investment in infrastructure, but also an explosion in the private sector, particularly in the services sector. And so that transformation's been underway anyway. But you add to that the depth of the economic frictions between China and the United States, the tariff war, the trade war, and the technology war, and then this shift to the left on economic policy I referred to before. My own feeling is that we'll start to see a couple of percentage points come off optimal Chinese growth levels because of this move to the left in their overall macro policy settings.
You mentioned now the economic shifts that we're seeing. There's also, of course, a lot of political shifts going on. We just had a few weeks ago the 6th plenum, the last plenum of the current Central Committee of the Communist Party before the 20th Party Congress happening next year. And all the signs, the way they're being interpreted, point towards the current Chinese president and Secretary General of the party, Xi Jinping, being confirmed in a little less than a year for a 3rd term, which would be unprecedented. It would be a break with tradition. How politically stable can a country as large and as complicated as China be if so much of its political system is geared towards one person? It seems that Xi's predecessors introduced, that system that they had for a reason. Is he not running the danger of making the country a lot less stable than it used to be? Even especially combined with, this move to the left that will possibly shave off some of the growth in future years.
Well, we always need to remind ourselves, Nico, that this is a Marxist-Leninist state. And Marxist-Leninists are not renowned for their sense of humor, whether they are European or Asian. They are ultimately focused on one thing, the securing of and the sustaining of political power, if necessary, and usually so with the barrel of a gun. So as we seek to understand the entrails of Chinese domestic politics, something I've been doing for most of my life since I was an embassy official in our embassy in Beijing back in the 80s, we need to look at 3 sets of meetings usually each year. The party plenum you've just referred to, there's one of those each year. It's the supreme governing body of the Communist Party. They just had the 6th plenum. Second thing we always need to look at is the state of the politics and the economy at the time of the National People's Congress, usually in March. And then for those of us who are particularly concerned with the economy, what's called the Central Economic Work Conference, normally held untidily for the rest of us in the West between Christmas and New Year each year. Put all those things together, what picture emerges? Xi Jinping has alienated a whole lot of people in China. In politics, he has purged a whole bunch of people, and a whole bunch of other people are frightened of being purged further if he becomes effectively leader for life, if he secures appointment, which I believe he will, as as Party General Secretary again of the 20th Party Congress next November. There's also a bunch of people in the private sector that he's alienated for the reasons that we just referred to before. And then there's what we would describe broadly as civil society, academics, artists, intellectuals, religionists, all of whom have had their freedom of space constricted by this new party orthodoxy. Put it all together then, there is a considerable amount of opposition to Xi Jinping. However, there is no galvanizing single voice around which this currently is organized. I think to prevent Xi Jinping's reappointment at the end of 2022 through to, I think, 2035, it would take a massive external event, an economic implosion, a new twist in the pandemic, or a national security crisis which turned out badly for China to derail his reappointment, re-election prospects.
You mentioned at the very beginning of your answer here that the key goal of the Communist Party in China is, of course, to stay in power. I wanted to follow up on this a little bit and ask you, if you're part of the Chinese leadership, what are the key challenges that you're likely to face over the next 5 to 10 years? If you're part of the inner circle, what is it that keeps you up at night? Is it the decoupling with the United States? Is it the demographic change that we've heard Sigmar Gabriel talk about? Is it the human rights situation? What are sort of the domestic political priorities as seen from the Chinese government? What are the problems that they think they most urgently would need to address to continue their path and to stay in power over the next 5 to 10 years?
You'll be surprised to know, Nico, that the worldview as seen through Beijing's lens is a little different from that seen from Lucerne. It's a little different from that seen from Brussels. And it's quite a lot different from that seen from Washington. Look, I always try to describe it as Xi Jinping's version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Number one is a Leninist party. He wants to stay in power. That's number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, it's a big one. And given the rigidities of a one-party state which can never smoothly engineer leadership transition, this occupies a huge amount of domestic political attention. Number 2 is maintaining the unity of the country. And that is the Taiwan question, the Xinjiang question, and the Tibet question. And this is religious dogma for the Chinese Communist Party. Number 3, however, is to grow the economy still, so that you don't end up with China having a middle income trap with an inability to break through and therefore not provide continued increases in living standards. Remember the Chinese middle class, the lower middle class, some 600 million of them, really only have a disposable income about 1,200 to 1,300 Chinese yuan a month. That's a couple of $100 US. And so this is still a long, long way to go. And I think the fourth one I'd point out to you is this, in its external front, to make sure that it has benign relationships with its 14 land borders in order to ensure that it doesn't have a surprising security incident on its immediate periphery. There are other priorities as well, but if we were to sit around the table of the Standing Committee of the Politburo right now, assuming you and I could get a ticket, which is unlikely, Nico, against the backdrop of the priorities etched in the mind of the 7 men who run the country, those 7 points would be near the top of the country's priorities or the leadership's priorities.
We've talked a lot now about Chinese domestic politics, but of course China has stepped up its global influence significantly over the last years through a number of initiative speeches, through more assertive foreign policy, but also through projects like the Belt and Road, the New Silk Road, and any number of things. And what I find surprising in these conversations, there's a lot of discussion about China expanding its influence, China possibly wanting to rule the world. And while undoubtedly China exerts a lot more influence today than it did probably 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago, it's never been very clear to me what kind of vision or to what end this influence is ultimately serving. So again, the view from Beijing, what kind of global system, what kind of ideal state of how the world looks like is China working towards? What's the purpose of all this influence? What's the purpose of being out there, building infrastructure in all these countries, what would they ultimately want to achieve? What would be considered a success in terms of how the global system works for China?
Sometimes, Nico, it's important to take the Chinese at face value. So when they say that their mid-century objective is to engineer, quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, unquote, that is code language for China becoming the most powerful country in the world. Let's be very clear about that, both economically, militarily, and technologically. Also, a country which by 2049, the centenary of the founding of the PRC, is one which would, from their perspective, have secured the return of Taiwan to Chinese national sovereignty. So what does that look like in practice? When I look at Xi Jinping's worldview, the best term I can describe it as is one of Marxist nationalism. So when he says he wants to produce a powerful modern socialist state by mid-century, we should also take that seriously. And that is that it's not simply capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It's actually a new form of Xi Jinping socialism with a new set of characteristics which have become clearer in his period in office, the ones that I described before. But on the nationalist part of, let's call it the ideological worldview or the ideological mission statement, it's a bit like this. As I said before, Taiwan back within Chinese sovereignty, ideally from their point of view by peaceful means, but if by mid-century it's not there, then the predisposition on the Chinese leadership is to do it by military means. Benign land borders with its 14 neighbouring states, pushing the United States back from Eastern Europe and the Western Pacific, where the US currently has 5 treaty allies. As far as Eurasia is concerned, turn the Belt and Road Initiative into one giant economic corridor to Western Europe by one means or another. And in the rest of the world, use the leverage of China's global economic footprint to bring about a new form of global rules-based system, which is more compatible with Chinese national interests and Chinese national values. You already see that, for example, Nico, in China's influence in international standards organizations as they engage in the debate with others about what technical standards should apply to particular new technologies in the future. So you asked what it would look like. I think it would broadly have those characteristics.
Speaking of China's global influence, Sigmar Gabriel in his opening remarks said, that the one area where we as the West, as Europe, as Switzerland, as the US, we must and should collaborate with China, of course, is responding to climate change. And we have seen in recent weeks 2 notable developments on that front. The first was the US-China climate agreement, which was signed and announced at the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And then, of course, the Biden-Xi virtual summit following just a few days later, which didn't yield any concrete results, but again, where climate change and the need for collaboration was a topic. How sustainable is this, let's call it a climate détente? How realistic do you think will it be that in the face of continued conflict between at least the US and China, but probably more broadly the West and China, the countries will be able to constructively and sustainably collaborate on climate change response? Isn't it fairly possible that climate change will just be, a victim of this broader conflict eventually?
Well, Nico, it's difficult but doable. We at the Asian Society have been running second tracks diplomacy between the United States and China going back to the beginning of 2020 on climate change, against the possibility that Democrats would win that election, that they could actually hit the ground running with their Chinese counterparts. I'm pleased to say that may have helped with what we've seen unfold between Xie Zhenhua, one of our second-track diplomatic partners, and John Kerry and his team, many of whom were members of our dialogue. Secondly, you asked, can it be quarantined politically and geostrategically? Again, difficult but doable. I argue it in these terms, and Nico, we should look at the US-China relationship as it unfolds within the framework of what I call managed strategic competition. That is, that there are a number of geostrategic and geopolitical red lines for which there is no compromise. But frankly, where the virtual summit came in helpfully the other day between Xi Jinping and President Biden was to establish mechanisms which will hopefully assist in managing those red lines peacefully rather than militarily. Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, Sino-Indian border, cyber and space. They're the categories. Then there's a bigger category of what I describe as open, no-holds-barred strategic competition. That's the rest of foreign policy, it's economic policy, it's trade, it's investment, it's technology, it's talent, it's the rest plus human rights. Then there's a third category, which is areas of defined strategic collaboration. That's where climate comes in. And so when it's looked at through the lens of Beijing and Washington, it's not this freestanding, wonderful global public good unmolested by the other domains, but it is seen through this, as it were, three-part prism. Can it survive? I think so. And the reason is not because either the Chinese or anybody else have a deep affection for the Swiss Confederation or the Australian Commonwealth. No, it's because they've worked out, like the Americans have worked out, it's in their deep national economic and environmental interests to bring down greenhouse gas reductions themselves as the world's biggest and second largest emitters. It's going to be an untidy process, but I think the most significant outcome of Glasgow, as you alluded to before in your remarks, was the re-establishment of this US-China climate change working group, looking at sector-specific initiatives, either in reforestation, either in technology standards, for example, look at electric vehicles in the future, but most critically, methane, and where that goes as a non-carbon greenhouse gas for the future. So I'm a bit glass half full on this question rather than a glass half empty. I think we can prevail on this because their national self-interests are deeply engaged.
Excellent. I think glass half full, glass half empty is probably as good as things are going to get right now. So on this mildly hopeful note, let's end here. And thank you very much, Kevin Rudd, coming to us straight from Sydney for all your insights and remarks. Thank you.